Thank you all for joining us today for Divided We Fall, a webinar series on how business can depolarize the US. This is a webinar series focused on political and social polarization in our country, specifically as a business issue. We're here to talk about the causes of polarization, the risks it poses to our businesses and our country, and solutions that businesses can embrace to help address this critical issue. My name is Sarah Bonk. I'm the founder of Business for America, and BFA is a business membership organization. We mobilize the business community to take action to increase civic engagement, protect voting rights, ensure election integrity, and combat polarization. And we are delighted today to be partnering with the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C. They hardly need an introduction, but of course, Niskanen Center is a wonderful think tank, a storied institution with some of the very best thinkers working to advance an open society. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, Association of Chamber of Commerce Executives, New Hampshire Businesses for Social Responsibility, the Civic Health Project, Bridge Alliance, and the Fulcrum. They all helped us get the word out about this event and make sure we could fill the room. So polarization, political polarization, is a deep and complex systems issue, and that's why we've broken the conversation into 4 parts. We've already covered the basics of polarization, understanding its causes, with a particular focus on the current political climate. Then in session 2, we talked about polarization as a cultural issue in our workplaces. You can find both of those videos on YouTube. And today we're focused on how business may be incentivizing polarization with its government affairs activities and political spending, and what it can do about it. And in our final session 4, we're going to talk about policy solutions to help depolarize politics and incentivize moderation. So let's get started. Over the past year, looking back to the 2020 election, the relationship of business with democracy has changed dramatically. And while there are some earlier examples of business engagement to get out the vote or address campaign finance issues, corporations have seldom weighed in publicly on how our politics and voting systems function in any meaningful, long-term, extended kind of way. 2020 really was a watershed year. It started in a very, like a set of positive activities where thousands of American businesses representing many millions of employees expressed their support for our democratic processes during the election. They took steps to ensure their employees would have ample time to vote, often including paid time. They helped recruit poll workers, and they even provided PPE and other supplies to help ensure safe voting during a pandemic. These businesses made a commitment to our representative democracy, a commitment to their employees' right to vote, and they took action. Now, businesses taking action to better our society is not new. And the movement for corporate social responsibility, or CSR, has been growing for decades and has really taken off in recent years. But it's important to recognize that the issue of democracy is special and different. Other CSR issues like climate and healthcare, sustainability, human rights, education, etc., these are all substantive issues, which is to say that they have a more direct and obvious impact on stakeholders and citizens and voters. Voting itself and political polarization, our election procedures, the government dysfunction that we're all experiencing, these are process issues. Our representative democracy, our republic, is really a process by which we make decisions on all the other issues. And that's why adding a civic dimension to corporate social responsibility has opened up a whole new can of worms for the business community. So when there were challenges to the 2020 election results, and some of Congress voted not to certify the election, and there was a riot in the Capitol itself, well, speaking out on these issues was uncharted territory for business, to say the least. The events of January 6th rippled through boardrooms and government affairs and public relations offices across the country. And some businesses froze or shut down their corporate PACs. Some have been advocating against restrictive state voting laws. Some are supporting federal legislation to address these issues. and others are basically trying to lay low and hope the whole thing blows over. But as state lawmakers across the country work to make it harder to vote under the guise of election security, the business community has been struggling with the right response. And as companies weigh their options, it can often feel like a no win situation. Speak out against these bills, get attacked and boycotted by the right. Don't speak out against these bills, get attacked and boycotted by the left. So that brings us to our first question. What is a company's political responsibility? When it comes to our democracy, what is a business's responsibility other than maximizing their own profitability? Well, a lot of us have talked about stakeholder capitalism in the past. When we talk to business leaders, most of them do feel a sense of obligation to care for their workforce and to leave our society better than they found it. They feel a sense of duty to all their stakeholders, not just their shareholders. And to be sure, there is a tension with the short term drive for quarterly profits. Shareholders still matter. But nonetheless, most would agree that they have an enlightened self interest in overcoming political polarization and that preserving our democratic institutions is both in the public interest and in the business interest. So, when we talk about corporate social responsibility, many companies that have defined their corporate social responsibilities are also recognizing that our polarized politics are preventing them from achieving their CSR goals. If you care about sustainability, you recognize that our political system isn't passing laws that are aligned with sustainability. And that's been a big driver for why corporate social responsibility is evolving to have a civic dimension. Corporate civic responsibility is recognizing that responsibility to protect our civic institutions, a duty to strengthen democracy. But we're also going to talk about that at a little deeper level here today in terms of a corporate political responsibility. That's companies looking specifically at their political activities to ensure, at the very least, that they're not causing harm, but potentially corporate political responsibility can entail a positive, proactive role to strengthen our democracy. So, as we're talking about how businesses may be incentivizing bad behavior and polarization and what we can do to stop it, it's important to remember that there are several forms of political speech here that may be driving negative outcomes. Most people will immediately think of the influence of corporate money in politics, but there's more to it than that. In addition to political spending, we need to look at lobbying and advocacy, the relationships that we have directly with lawmakers and public officials, and the influence that has. There are external communications and influence, including where businesses put our advertising dollars and our philanthropy, and of course, employee communications. Each of these activities has an impact on our political system, and each of them may contribute to political polarization and dysfunction, whether intentionally or not. So, with all this in mind, what are companies supposed to do? How can companies that recognize the harms of political polarization and care about democracy make sure that their actions are aligned with their values? And really, what does that even look like in today's deeply polarized political environment, which is a total minefield? It's really a complex equation for today's corporate leaders. And I know that our panelists are going to have lots of interesting perspectives and useful advice. The only option we really don't have is to do nothing. Preserving our democracy is critical to the future of our country and our businesses, but we simply cannot allow democracy to fail. As this headline says, business leaders are realizing that silence on voting rights means agreement, or as the Rush lyric says, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. So, thank you again for joining us today. I hope that by the end of this conversation, you will find some hope for a path through this political quagmire and that you will take away some practical steps that any company can take to not just protect their own reputation and interests as we're going through this quagmire, but also to strengthen our democracy. The future of our country really does depend on it. So, with that, I'm going to pass the microphone to Richard Idlin, Business for America's National Policy Director. Richard, please take it away.
Great, good. Thank you, Bonk, for that excellent summary. So welcome, everyone. So as Bonk noted, the discussion today is really focused on the increasing pressure and expectation from society at large that corporations account for their political activity and looking at the impact that those activities have on the well-functioning of our democracy. And we want to dig into, to look at how companies' political activity either supports or in some cases might undermine the very institutions and systems that companies rely on in order to achieve economic success and produce products and goods and services in the economy. And we also want to look then at how companies can possibly, through a shift in their political activity and political spending, change the behavior of elected officials. So there's a question here about whether corporate behavior incentivizes elected officials to behave in a certain way. And if so, as Bonk suggested, what would a change in operational practices by companies effectuate in the political process? We also want to think a bit about the risks that companies face, both at the firm level, reputational risk from political activity. Bonk mentioned boycotts. That's certainly a risk to the firm, as well as systemic risks. So if a company is supporting elected officials, for instance, who have chosen to not certify the electoral college results, that is something we would consider a systemic risk. And then finally, we want to think about how companies' political activity, which is a fairly broad set of activities, affects polarization and what role can business play. So before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to mention sort of one interesting data point to demonstrate how public interest and scrutiny of political spending in particular has become a much bigger issue in the past several years. So as you all know, the publicly traded companies have shareholder meetings, and proxy resolutions are a tool that activists use to try to influence corporate behavior. And in 2019, there were 51 political spending proposals introduced in the S&P 500. So 51, this is about 10% of all the companies in the S&P, and 0 of those resolutions passed, but garnered an average of 28% support. A year later, in 2020, there were 55 proposals, and 6 of those actually passed. And support on average rose to 35%, so a 7% increase. This year, we have at least 30 proposals, and Bruce, one of our panelists, may update me on that, but at least 30 proposals, and 5 of the 7 that where there's been a vote have actually now passed. So it's a significant trend. And one example at United Airlines, 67% of shareholders supported a resolution calling for the company to be more transparent about who it was contributing money to. So we're going to dig in here on those topics. We're really happy to have several thought leaders and people who've been working both on maybe the bleeding edge and the leading edge of this idea of corporate political responsibility, and who have in many ways helped to shape and are now defining the field, which is really exciting. So our panelists include Elizabeth Doty, who is the director of the Urb Institute's Corporate Political Responsibility Task Force at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And the purpose of that institute is to help companies better align their civic and political interactions with their commitments to purpose, value, sustainability, and ultimately to their stakeholders. From 2012 to 15, Elizabeth was a Network and Lab Fellow at the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University, where her research focused on the challenges of supporting companies to keep their promise to stakeholders. And based on that research, Elizabeth was named the National Thought Leader in by Trust across America in 2016 and 17. David Clooney is the executive director of the Black Economic Alliance, the nation's only coalition of business leaders and aligned advocates committed to economic progress and prosperity for the Black community, with a specific focus on work, wages, and wealth. Prior to joining BEA, David led the state and local government relations team at JP Morgan Chase in New York City. And prior to joining JP Morgan Chase, David served as the executive secretary at the US Department of the Treasury, and it was an appointee of President Obama. David also has a background as a litigation associate at the law firm of Paul Weiss. And Bruce Freed is the president and co-founder at the Center for Political Accountability in Washington, D.C., which is dedicated to increased transparency and responsible corporate political spending. Bruce has been a leader in the money and politics space for many years, and under his direction, the center has produced the Zicklin Index, which benchmarks this S&P 500 companies on their political disclosure and accountability policies and practices. And Bruce has also co-authored a number of major reports, including Collision Course and Conflicted Consequences, which examine the heightened risk to companies of their conflicted political spending. So welcome to you all. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. So Elizabeth, let me start with you and maybe level set a little bit as to what we mean by corporate political responsibility. We understand that in some ways it's an outgrowth of corporate social responsibility. And so help us better understand what we mean when we talk about a corporation's responsibility to the political system within which it operates.
Terrific. Thank you. And I'm so glad to be here. And I'm so glad you all have framed up the question as not whether companies should start to jump in now that we're facing this destructive polarization, but how, because companies are already deeply involved. And I would say the task force on corporate political responsibility is focused on helping to align on a definition, but based on an article from 2019 by Tom Lyons and a whole slew of academics working on CSR. They came up with a draft definition, and I can show a small graphic here that will maybe give us a little framing we can use. The premise of it, before I show the framing, the diagram, is that one of the most critical ways companies could advance CSR is by looking at how they are politically engaged. That this was what the results of this whole group of researchers was, that CSR needs CPR in order to advance sustainability and those societal outcomes that Bonk talked about, or Sarah Bonk talked about. So that group came up with a framework that says there might be, you might think of it as 3 levels. At a minimum, being a responsible actor in the society, and the current rules we have around political spending depend on transparency. They depend on, at a minimum, shareholders, but other stakeholders as well, to be able to tell whether companies are engaging and how. Both their spending, which Bruce Freed and the CPA has done so much to help to disclose, but also their lobbying and their positions. And right now, that is far from complete. The second is then, to what Sarah Bonk talked about, is to be aligned and accountable to those stakeholders. You're not speaking out of both sides of your mouth, or having oversight, right? To know where you are engaging and on what basis you're intervening, and having consent from those shareholders, or in a corporate PAC, knowing what your stakeholders' preferences are. As some companies found in the wake of the January 6th insurrection, that this was not aligned with what their employees had thought they were contributing to with their PAC contributions. And then lastly is this level of responsibility. And I think this is the area where we hope the task force and these kinds of conversations can help work out what is a company's responsibility to those more process-oriented, institutional level issues, and how do companies' political activities support the foundations on which I would include here markets, not just society and civic institutions, but the premise from economics textbooks of full cost pricing. What is companies' political responsibility not to try to externalize costs and risks on society through their lobbying influence or political influence? And then to the planet, right? To the systems on which life depends. Well, we've been thinking of it, if you look at the columns at the bottom in very faint type there, that operationalizing these will require companies to think about principles. On what basis? I think the most important question I've heard was in the forward to the CPA-Zicklin Index, I think in 2019. On what basis do businesses influence civic and political affairs? And then secondly, how does that translate into our practices? Where are our bright lines? What policies does that require us to support? And what processes do we need to adopt in order to integrate this and fulfill those commitments in practice? So this is the territory that we're thinking needs to be explored. Lots to be discussed.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. We're going to come back to that. But David, let me ask you a question. When you were at JP Morgan Chase, did a framework like this factor into how the company made decisions as to who to give money to and what it saw its role being? And obviously, companies make these investment decisions based on what they think they can get out of it, right? There's a lot of self-interest involved. But was there also this broader consideration, as Elizabeth just defined, about the role of corporate spending and corporate political activity on society?
So absolutely, and I think Elizabeth framed it really well. And I'll say, I was at JP Morgan Chase from 2015 to 2020, and during that time, the entire industry, but particularly JP Morgan Chase, was going through an evolution of how it thought about its own corporate social responsibility, its corporate political responsibility, and even the way the org chart was set up was interesting in that I was head of state and local government relations, reported up through government relations, but I was in the corporate responsibility group. And we worked hand in glove with the foundation, with the community engagement team, Office of Nonprofit Engagement, and we all tried to be synced up on who is going to care about where we stand or don't, where we speak up or don't on these issues, and how do we make all these things, how do we find harmony among all these competing interests? But then also we think about we're the largest bank in America. We have 250,000 employees, trillions of dollars under management. How do we also think about the impact that we're having with our decisions, both from a business perspective, but especially our political advocacy? So there was an evolution. It is still ongoing. While I was there, for example, JP Morgan Chase set up the Policy Center. They brought in someone, Heather Higginbottom, who had been in the both Clinton and Obama administrations, had been on the Hill for a long time, and essentially was trying to think of where could they speak proactively on policy in a way that had a positive impact on communities and a lot of the corporate social responsibility priorities they set. But there was a lot that they had to manage and balance with their what affected the bottom line. And I'll give one example, which was the 2017 tax cuts. Obviously, a place where the firm saw a significant amount of reduction in its annual tax liability, and a place where there was a lot of friction between the business community and individual tax provisions, and what was best for American citizens versus what was best for the business community, and who was really benefiting from those cuts. Right after the bill passed, there's a lot of conversation about how do companies show up, and a lot of companies were giving employees bonuses and making different statements, and JP Morgan Chase came out with a $20 billion investment and commitment to communities that included everything from increasing lending in certain neighborhoods on home loans and small businesses, to increasing the amount of money they gave to employee benefit programs, increasing the minimum wage. And essentially that was an acknowledgement that one, they did a lot of advocacy that really benefited the company and really benefited the business community, that had an impact on others, but two, that people were looking to them for leadership and looking to such a large employer and such a large advocate, because they have such an outsized amount of influence in Washington D.C. That they had to make a statement, and if they didn't make a statement, that would be to Sarah's point at the beginning, that would be a statement in itself. So it really, this is an evolving concept of how each company thinks about this, and it was absolutely an ever-present discussion while we were there. And I can even add that I think my my level of comfort with speaking up on things that were personally important to me as one of the few Black senior representatives on that team was important because they needed to be thinking about perspectives of underrepresented and communities that perhaps would have a strong opinion about things we did or did not speak up on. So absolutely an evolution. I really like the way that Elizabeth framed it, and I do think there's a lot of ground to be made up on all three of those: transparency, accountability, and responsibility. So much more work to do there.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. We're going to get back to that. Bruce, let me bring you into the conversation here. You have pioneered the Zicklin Index, but also have been focused a lot on thinking about a code of conduct. So sort of operationalizing the model that Elizabeth showed and sort of giving other companies, in addition to JP Morgan Chase, sort of a framework to use when thinking about their political activities. And I would encourage everyone to go online and find a copy of the Zicklin Model Code of Conduct for corporate political spending. And Bruce, as I read through this again this morning, I was really struck by point 12, which is under the model code, the board of directors shall, independent of a review taken of what the company's spending money on, it should consider the broader societal and economic harm and risks posed by the company's political spending. So give us a sense as to what this code of conduct is and why a company should adopt this.
Richard, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with everyone. Let me just open up for a moment, just dealing with the support from investors for corporate political disclosure. You provided the figures, but with the CPA model resolution, which is really the standard resolution for corporate political disclosure and accountability, in 2019, the average vote on the resolution was 36.4%. That jumped to 41.9% last year, and so far this year is 48.1%. I mean, and there have been 6 majority votes this year, 2 at 80%, then United Airlines at 68%, and then we had one at some at 53, 52, and 51. So there's very, very strong support. Last year there were majority votes too. We've always had about 1, 2, or 3 majority votes per proxy season. You asked about the model code, and it's a very, very important question that you have, and an area that companies need to address. Let me just start off by saying that the center has always been agnostic about political spending by companies. If they choose to spend politically, it's a choice that they need to make. If they choose to spend politically, then they need to do it transparently. They need to do it with accountability. And they need to pay very close attention to the impact of the spending and what it associates the company with. And that's even more important today as we've had, the issues of racial justice in the forefront, as we've had the attack on democracy, the insurrectionary attack on the Capitol on January 6th. The aftermath is companies pause their political spending, but you have companies, beginning to come back and re-engage. The purpose of the model code is to provide companies with a framework for approaching their decision making, for approaching how they look at their political spending, how they evaluate the spending, the framework in which they're making the decisions, and really looking at the immediate impact and the broad impact. The purpose is really to give companies sort of a 3-dimensional framework to look at their political spending. They can look at it short term, but also looking at it long term, looking at it in terms of narrow issues that they are concerned about, but also, as you've talked about and as Bonk talked about, that broader environment that companies need to grow and thrive. And when you talk about democracy today, democracy is not just an abstract concept for companies. but it gives them a level playing field in which to operate, one where they don't feel that they're under pressure. They're not being called out. They're not being bullied. You know, when you take a look at the last 4 years, it was a very different environment in which companies were operating. And the question is, how are they going to shape this through their political spending? I'm talking about not just PAC spending, but the center really focuses on political spending by companies with corporate funds. That's where your contributions get into the 5, 6, and 7 figures. Contributions made directly by companies to candidates, to organizations, but also to third party groups. And the third party groups are very important because a company may give to a third party group, but not pay attention to where the money ends up. Yet, where that money ends up has tremendous consequences in what it associates the company with, what it enables. You know, and we could see that now in the whole issue of voting rights and voter nullification. I mean, the center's reports that you mentioned, conflicted consequences, and a forthcoming report entitled Corporate Enablers, takes a deep dive in the attack on voting rights in 7 states, and the political spending by leading companies that have made statements on diversity, that have policies on diversity, that gave $100,000 or more to third party groups, and what that has enabled in terms of election of the legislatures that are addressing the issue of voting rights. So I think companies, you know, would be well advised to take a close look at the model code provisions 9, 11, and 12 to provide that broader framework that are in their self-interest, that really are affect the bottom line, and that also are in their broader self-interest in terms of the type of environment that they need to grow and thrive.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. David, to pick up on that point, you know, you were quoted a number of weeks ago, I think, in a New York Times article saying something to the effect that companies demonstrate their values by how they use their resources. And this article related to the topic of voting rights, which the Black Economic Alliance has been very active in, you know, at the state level in particular. And so how, you know, how when JP Morgan Chase or Citi decided to pause their corporate political spending for a number of months and are now re-engaging, how has, you know, particularly at, you know, to the extent that you can inform us, what's been the thinking about adopting a code of conduct or a set of principles, as Bruce has suggested companies should?
Yeah, Bruce made a great point, which is, you know, we at the Black Economic Alliance have been really leaning in on a lot of companies who a year ago, especially, you know, after the death of George Floyd and through Juneteenth and through the summer of, you know, racial justice and equity protests and advocacy, made a lot of statements and commitment about racial equity, about how they're going to use their platforms differently, how they're going to use their resources differently, and committed a lot of dollars to do that. And then, you know, looking at which of those companies have then contributed in a way politically that is either consistent, at odds, or somewhere in between with those statements last year. And that's what we're trying to. That's the string we're trying to pull on for companies, is to, you know, kind of remind them of the different statements they've made, either through rhetoric and through their spending and their resources. Of, you know, you have said these things are important, but this is where your resources are going, and this is essentially what you're demonstrating is important. The two can't exist. So we're asking you to prioritize and make very clear for everyone, including all of your stakeholders, internal and external, and the communities that you're impacting with your action or inaction. Make very clear what your priorities are by, you know, where you're putting your resources. So it's been an uncomfortable conversation with a number of companies who, for example, some companies have been inconsistent with what they've done at the federal level and at the state and local level. So some companies have, at the federal level, held back money that they were giving, PAC money that they were giving to any of the, for example, 147 members of the House who voted or refused to vote to certify the results of the election. But then they are still giving to a lot of, if not entire, both parties and individual members at the state and local level who are pushing and advancing a lot of the restrictive voting laws. And one of the things we've gotten back is, we can't stop giving to, in some cases where, for example, an entire party, so let's take Georgia, for example. In Georgia, the entire Republican Party voted in favor of the voting law, and it passed on party lines and was opposed by Democrats. They can't stop giving to one party and not give to another. But we've essentially said, you have to figure out how you square the circle on where you're spending your money, what message that sends, and if you have to stop giving in a whole state, perhaps we talk a lot about defund the police and reallocating resources. Perhaps you reallocate those resources elsewhere, and if it is important to you to make a statement, then reallocate those resources away from a party, for example, or even a committee. I think some of the committees that they give to are supporting candidates that they would not support in their individual rights. So really peeling back the onion on where that money is going, the kind of ultimate beneficiaries, and having companies be much more deliberate and responsible and transparent about where that money is going and what the ultimate impact is.
Right. Yeah, Elizabeth, I was going to ask you a question here, but let me just frame it up for a moment. So I think, what David just pointed out is this is complicated, right? Companies have a lot of competing interests, commercial interests. Some are local, some are national, some are international in scope. And they don't always coincide, those interests. And sometimes, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing within the company as well. And my question, Elizabeth, to you is, you've thought a lot about the risks that this inconsistent behavior within corporations around political spending produces. We talk quickly about the firm level risk and the systemic risk. So I wonder, maybe if you could take us up one level, sort of, and help us think about these types of risks that corporate officials face for either being inconsistent or, in some cases, not really knowing what the government affairs people are spending money on. Maybe they're trying, maybe directors are trying to inoculate themselves. But to Bruce's point, that is not a very responsible perspective that a company's taking. So help us think through that about risk, if you would.
Great. And I will, what I want to point to, we have an hour and a half that we're trying to untangle as we've talked about this systems issue. So if I could make two small points before I go to the higher altitude, I want to say when companies are responding to those who challenge them, and both the Black Economic Alliance and the Center for Political Accountability are doing this, one way to look at them is as connecting those dots. These are people who are watching for your commitments versus your action, and that is work. It's incredibly valuable. So rather than viewing them as an attack, view it as another implication of something you're already doing and check it out. I think that's incredibly valuable. The other is, in practice, I've noticed, and some of the new criteria I'm seeing really have a bias towards incumbency, and especially committee leadership positions. But if you go a little deeper and connect the dots, you'll see that those committee positions often involve contributing massive amounts of monies to the party. So it's a self-reinforcing process. And so one thing companies could do is to reconsider the bias towards incumbency and maybe go to principles rather than bipartisanship. So that said, I will share another slide that we've been finding useful in just kind of getting on the table some of the things to think about with risk. Let's see here. And I think this is one way to remember why your political engagements matter. And someone was just saying to me that in a way you could look at the firm level risks as signals of systems level risk. Like someone is speaking up to show that there's a downstream effect or a stakeholder effect that may not be obvious to you. So the way we've been summarizing it, there's the obvious brand and reputation, and I think collision course, the CPA report, is really a great snapshot of that. But there are so many every day of how companies are contradicting the commitments they've made, as you said, David. This is affecting employees, the potential to recruit talent. It's a major factor for generations coming into the workforce now. Customers, communities, stakeholders, and investors, access to capital. Bruce understated a bit the appetite for investors for disclosure. It's one of the areas where it's just a no-brainer that vast majorities of investors would rather know what you're doing. So you will probably be evaluated differently on ESG scorecards and ratings as those get standardized. And there are metrics related to political alignment in those ratings. So there will be firm level risks, and then there's legal and regulatory risk that'll affect the firm. But as Bruce mentioned, that larger environment, this is the area where it's very easy for organizations to delay or punt, to think it's not going to happen tomorrow. These happen in tipping points. The threshold seems like it's always going to be down the road until you get a January 6th, until you get a vote on election, on voting rights in Georgia. And suddenly you realize those systemic forces have been building. And we've grouped the systemic forces into four, very simplistically related to the E, S, G, and financial. But there are systemic tipping points around the environment that if we don't get to action on climate, on carbon soon, this is going to, I've heard an estimate through the World Economic Forum that if we manage policy well, it'll be a 1% hit to GDP annually. And if we don't, it'll be 5%. Right? Who knows when you're making that investment in, spending or lobbying, what you're trading off there, but it will come back to hit us. The next is the social level, opportunity, mobility, inclusion. We have not tackled this. We've been talking about it for ages. It's been clear that opportunity and social mobility, inclusion, and justice aspects, education, as AI hits us, all of these are going to affect the purpose of the economy, right? And spending power and social stability. And then the civic institutions that all businesses depend on, the rule of law, but also, what kind of society we want to live in, and the values we espouse and the commitments companies have to supporting society as its own entity, not just there for economic purposes. And we've seen that these can tip this. One thing I think many government affairs folks can feel pressed and have difficulty harmonizing, as you say, Richard. David, you mentioned harmonizing and the complexity is to miss that the accumulated impacts of that can be crowding out responsiveness, crowding out representation. Members of Congress now spend something like 30 to 70% of their time raising money. Gillens and Page did a famous study in 2000, published in 2014, that the policy outcomes from Congress have about a 0% correlation with the preferences of the public, and a very strong correlation with the preferences of special interest groups or economic higher income levels. So just business as usual, engaging for your business interests, can crowd out the responsiveness of civic institutions. And that's a real consequence, right? And it will bite us, and it also does not feel legitimate to many people. And finally, financial stability, the ability to pursue those longer term goals versus the pressure. There are many laws right now. I think the ones I've tracked have to do with capital gains, long-term versus short-term, some of those rules. There are many rules that are pushing companies towards the shorter term, and those affect the economic value over the long term. Our investment in public goods and infrastructure, regulatory complexity. Fantastic article by Lee Drutman called America's Lobbying Addiction, says that trying to gain through lobbying often leads to more complexity of regulatory regimes. And in the end, some of the risks are simply our own, just this is not what we signed up to do. It's a values issue for many executives. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that covered some of what you're looking at, and why this is worth spending time on, even though it may feel like something executives didn't sign up for.
Right. No, that's very helpful to understand the firm level, the systemic, and then the moral imperative. Bruce, let me go back to you to ask you about how what Elizabeth just suggested relates to the code of conduct. And one of the things you've mentioned before is that many companies feel somewhat beholden to the request from elected officials or PACs or 527s to contribute, because they understand their economic self-interest is really at stake. But you suggested that if they don't have a policy and if they don't have some process in place, they're somewhat subject to, maybe being extorted. So can you say more about how the adoption of internal practices or adherence to a code would help companies, develop a process that can make them somewhat independent of the pressure that they might face?
Richard, let me just start off by saying that I completely agree wholeheartedly with what David said. I mean, David laid out from the inside of JP Morgan Chase and from his experience, the real challenges that companies face from spending. And he posed very, I think, very seminal questions in terms of what companies should be doing. In terms of your question, I'm going to speak about this from multiple perspectives. From my perspective as heading up the center and engaging companies for the past 18 years of corporate political spending and corporate political disclosure. From a stint that I did as a lobbyist. From my days on Capitol Hill, and I spent several years on Capitol Hill on the Senate side, House side, personal staff, committee staff, dealing with companies, in the offices, and as a reporter covering Washington. I think a model code is absolutely critical for companies for giving them a framework on what they're going to do. It gives them control over their spending. It gives them the ability to say yes, but also the ability to say no. And I've been told by friends of mine, at leading companies, that the code, that having policies is very important for being able to say no and to do it in a way that is not personal. I had one instance where a friend of mine with a company was telling me that a governor of his state who was running for president in 2016, the super PAC for that candidate approached the company and asked for a contribution, to his super PAC. Company in the end did not give, made the decision not to give. But the fact is, when the no was given, it appeared to be a personal no, rather than a policy decision that would have depersonalized it and would have made it easier for the company to say no. So I think the code is very important. The code also, deals with the type of issues that David was talking about, the issue of alignment. Alignment is absolutely central today with so many companies having policies, on the environment, on their, corporate citizenship, on, on diversity. With companies now placing a great emphasis on core values, defining who they are, and then engaging in spending, where the consequences of the spending conflict with their core values and positions. That poses a very serious risk. The risk today that companies face has increased exponentially. And alignment is a key part of that. And alignment means looking out. Looking at, as David said, what are the ultimate consequences of the company's spending? For instance, when a company gives to a 527 committee, let's say one of the state legislative campaign committees, and that contribution goes and helps to elect the state legislature that's dealing with legislation attacking voting rights. Or a company gives to an attorneys general association, and the company's money helps elect an attorney general, let's say, who's bringing suit to oppose certification of election results or to attack to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. Companies need to pay attention to the impact of their spending and take a look, have a screen on, what are their policies, positions, and their values, and how does the political expenditure of the company align with that. This is very important, and it's laid out in our conflicted consequences report. It's laid out in the corporate enablers report. It was framed in the collision course report, and all of that is pulled together in the model code. And I would urge companies to look at not just the 12 provisions of the model code, but the preamble, because the preamble provides that framework, how to think about the political spending, and also, it addresses the importance of the of directors knowing where the company's money is going, asking those questions and then setting the policies, ensuring that those policies are followed. All of these things are very important for protecting companies today in a political environment that is fraught with much greater danger than I think any point in recent American history.
And can I make just one quick point to reinforce? I absolutely agree. And I think both Elizabeth and Bruce put the importance of having a core set of principles. They both articulated it very well. I will add to that, the other thing that it helps protect against is situations where companies are responding to an incident and being pulled in different directions. And there are some cases where I think the leadership of an organization can speak in their personal right and end up speaking on behalf of the corporation. And sometimes their personal opinion is at odds with the rest of the organization. So I think it forces consensus building inside of an organization, and it forces organizations to look at any given set of circumstances against their set of principles to figure out, how does this align or not, and how do we process these requests that are coming in these competing interests against our core set of principles.
And David, who would be involved in that discussion, in a corporation about creating that alignment? How does that work?
I smile because I've seen it go right and I've seen it go wrong. And when that apparatus is set up, you have the team that kind of gets put on it. They make sure that they are checking with the right folks. They come back and they make a decision quickly. When that's not set up, you have calls of 50 people, trying to figure it out. Everybody's yelling over each other, and then they're adding people to an email chain. And I've seen it through my time at Treasury, my time at JP Morgan Chase, and my time now at the Black Economic Alliance. And when it is done well, I think you have people who have access to the right parts of the leadership, but also the right external and internal stakeholders, so that they're speaking on behalf of different perspectives and they're able to do a true cost benefit analysis. That may look different in different places. It's often some combination of the businesses, the lines of business that are affected, the government relations folks, the legal folks, the communications folks, but you have to have the right perspectives represented. When it goes wrong, you have just a hodgepodge of different. Either you have one or two people making a decision in a vacuum, or you have a group of 100 people trying to come to a decision. Excuse me, and it's just a really inefficient and unproductive process.
Right, right. And Bruce, did you want to add to that?
This is a corporate governance issue. And I want to say that because we have a situation today where we have a dysfunctional political system, and where the whole issue of political disclosure and political accountability, or political disclosure in particular, has been unable to be addressed through the political system. You take a look at, since 2003, there has not been any possibility that legislation would be able to move through Congress requiring much greater disclosure, which would be a very important step, I think, for bringing the type of accountability and change that we're looking at. But corporate governance has allowed this whole issue to be addressed, and we could see it through the use of the shareholder resolution, our engagement with companies. Companies, by recognizing this as a risk management issue, are taking steps and can take further steps that can contribute to dealing with this crisis. And it's in their self-interest, and it's in the broader societal interest. So I think this is extremely important. That really you have to circumvent the political system today to be able to deal with this, and to be able to have companies at this point start playing the role that they should be playing, whereas David said, they need to be able to pay much closer attention on an integrated basis with their political spending, what it means, and how they create the type of policies that create a structure that I think benefits everyone.
Elizabeth, I want to bring you in here. How does this connect to the broader frame about stakeholder governance of corporations? So, increasingly there is pressure on companies to be more disclosing, more transparent. But just as an aside, I'm not sure there's an active movement within the private sector for, as Bruce suggested, federal legislation on corporate disclosure, on disclosure of contributions. So, what's your sense of the within the work you're doing about a movement, maybe within the private sector, for greater transparency and greater involvement in more stakeholders involved in corporate governance?
Oh, well, yeah, I'm with you on that, but I would disagree about the movement. I think we're facing a conflict of interest between those in office now, or since 2003 or 2004, and the widespread support. I mean, Just Capital just came out with a report. 78% of Americans want political disclosure. It's a foundation of the Citizens United decision. The assumption premise was there'd be disclosure.
Right.
Widespread interest among shareholders, right? It's just that there is a rider introduced that Bruce can speak to. And that's one place companies could take action right now. It's just to remove that conflict of interest and allow the comments to be heard with the SEC. But the other side on stakeholder governance, I just came across SASB, the rule setting standards board for sustainability, that has a lot to do with stakeholder interests. They define leadership and governance as a critical board issue, to your point, Bruce, related to tensions in interests. That this is the place where economic rules can be set to externalize costs and risks that trade off stakeholders, that remove opportunity, that disadvantage groups that have historically been disadvantaged, and that managing those trade-offs is the heart of moving towards stakeholder capitalism, along with ending short-termism or curtailing short-termism. So both of these areas, I can see the entire stakeholder capitalism movement and the debate with the ultimate logic of shareholder clarity. It's centering on how are you influencing the economic rules of the game? How are you influencing, for example, through the state efforts, companies have contributed a lot to whether workers are represented. However you feel about unions, there was a massive state legislation to change the funding model for unions, which companies weighed in on and supported. That could be an area where you want to relook if you're looking at wage growth or the ability to get financial security. So the intersection between stakeholder governance and political influence, especially on economic rules of the game, I think is burgeoning within the stakeholder capitalism movement. And I think it's the area where you reconcile the two. Does that speak to your?
Yeah, it does. And Bruce, back to you for a moment. Part of the there's a movement, obviously, now for the SEC to play a more active role in requiring disclosure and transparency that would create behavioral change in how companies operate. So, there was a bill passed several years ago that prohibited from the SEC from requiring that. But now, with the Democratic majority in the House, that bill probably has a chance to be resurrected. That would require disclosure. So can you say something about what's happening in the Securities and Exchange Commission and how that might get to Elizabeth's point to push for more disclosure?
There's an appropriations rider. This was a rider attached to an appropriations bill covering the SEC, the independent agency's appropriation bill, that has blocked the SEC from considering a corporate political disclosure rule that was submitted a decade ago by Rob Jackson from Columbia Law School and a group of law professors. I want to say that that rulemaking petition came out of a conference that the center had held at the Wharton School on Citizens United and the changing political role of the corporation, where a colleague and I suggested to Rob the need for an SEC rule, and Rob said, "Okay, we'll go ahead and we'll draft the petition and submit it." We're waiting for that to be lifted. There's an expectation that when the appropriations bill comes up for the SEC, that it's very likely that the rule will be lifted. Then the SEC will have the opportunity to go ahead. You have two commissioners who have spoken out very strongly on the need for a corporate political disclosure rule: Carolyn Crenshaw and Allison Lee. Gary Gensler, the chair, was asked about that at his confirmation hearing. He endorsed the rule. At some point, when that rider is lifted, I think it's very likely the SEC will be adopting a political disclosure rule. And that rule is really what is really interesting is that rule is going to track, I think, the disclosure indicators of the CPA-Zicklin Index. If a company is a trendsetter company on the CPA-Zicklin Index, which means having a score of 90 or above, that means that they've really checked the boxes on disclosure, and that company would be in a very strong position to be able to easily abide by a disclosure rule. The disclosure rule deals with political spending, election related, and I think this is very important to understand. Election related spending by companies using corporate funds. So it would cover contributions made by companies to parties, candidates, and committees where allowed by law. Companies can't contribute directly to federal candidates, but they can do that in about half the states to state candidates. They would cover contributions to the 527 committees, the Governors Associations, state legislative campaign committees, and attorneys general associations. Company payments to trade associations that are used for election-related purposes. Contributions to the 501c4s. Now, the trade association payments and C4 payments are critical because no disclosure is required. And in those areas, companies face a real risk of inadvertent disclosure. Somebody, a person soliciting a company could say, oh, you don't have to worry about your contribution being disclosed. Well, yes, there is that inadvertent risk. You can see in the CPA-Zicklin Index an increasing number of companies, and this is from year to year, that are either prohibiting or fully disclosing their contributions or payments to C4s, to trade associations. The same thing with 527s, the whole gamut. I think that that rule will go through, and that rule, by the way, is going to address the issue of third-party spending, because it is highly likely that a company will be required to ask the third party, where does our money ultimately end up? That's important for assessing the risk that the company faces from what it is associated with. And as David talked about, it's going to bring back to the company, Elizabeth also talked about this, it's going to bring back to the company and to the directors, what the implications of their spending is. I think it's going to get the companies to be paying much closer attention to the spending and the consequences.
David, when you think about the possibility of SEC action, and then you consider that some companies like Charles Schwab decided to just withdraw from any spending, but knowing that companies have a legal right to contribute. There's no prohibition against them spending money in this political system that we live in. What advice do you have to companies about becoming more consistent? Using their funding, as you suggested earlier, maybe for good. So, the companies that might have signed a statement about voter suppression or restrictive voting practices, but then go ahead and give money to organizations that are encouraging restrictive voting practices. How does a company maybe become more proactive and support the causes that it genuinely, believes in, or it states it believes in?
Yeah, I think it's thinking about looking at their political spending and thinking about a story and narrative that tells, and being able to drive that narrative in a way that they can be proud of, and that they are happy with the impact that it has, not only on their company, but on the industry and on the entire community. So I think if you are doing spending that you either have to reallocate, pull back from, or what have you, how can you, what is the story you're telling with your spending? And what things do you lean in on as a company, and why? And drawing the connection between why you've chosen to spend your resources there politically and what is the ultimate impact and outcome you're looking to have. I think that's a particular place where a lot of companies have shifted from a singular focus on how does this impact the bottom line, how is this going to save us money each year, Does this create a better regulatory environment for us to do business? All of those things continue to be important, but now there's much more consideration given to what impact does this have on the industry? What impact does this have on, desire either advocacy for or against or abstention from engaging? What impact does that have on the environment and community and the national conversation on particular issues? And I think that's companies being much more proactive about that and not being pulled along with the kind of political winds, but thinking about how they can drive an affirmative, proactive narrative on what they're trying to achieve and how they're putting their resources behind that objective. I think that will help them square the circle on how to weigh these competing interests.
And Elizabeth had mentioned that there's an inclination to give to incumbents and sitting members of Congress. So there's a question from Shannon Watson from the St. Paul Chamber of Commerce that asks, what could be done to encourage companies from giving to third-party candidates or people who may be focused more on a moderate set of principles, neither right nor left. Is there an opportunity, David, for that to happen within?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Although I saw Elizabeth kind of raise her finger. Did you want to add something to the last response before I get to the third party?
No, I can wait. I'll build on after you answer this. I'm curious to your answer.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one where I think to date companies have been that's been an internal firm risk that they've thought about. If we support, for example, if there's a 5-term incumbent who we've been working with, they have a lot of power, and they are a committee chair because they've been there so long on a committee of jurisdiction over us. If we support their opponent, the opponent loses. We're then stuck with this relationship with this incumbent who we now have to work with and who is unhappy with us and will likely have significant impact negatively on our ability to get things done, particularly in our area of jurisdiction. I think there are opportunities to support third-party candidates and others, but there's a very low risk profile typically with how companies think about whether they will give to incumbents and opponents and third parties. I think they think about the cost benefit analysis of if we get involved, what is how much control do we think we have on the outcome? How likely is one outcome versus another? And then in any event, what is the cost benefit analysis of, in the best case scenario, how does this investment help us? In the worst case scenario, how does, supporting the wrong candidate hurt us? So I think you've seen a very low risk profile to date, but that is a place where if you're supporting an incumbent party and essentially a system, particularly at the state and local level, that has perpetuated some of the, larger societal problems and larger kind of environment problems that are then causing problems for your ability to do business, then I think you'll see companies probably step one will be them pulling back from supporting some of the incumbents they used to support. And then step two will be finding opportunities to support either opponents or third party candidates in places where there is a lower risk, but starting to do that more than they have in the past.
Right. Yep. Elizabeth, you want to add to that, please?
Yeah, I think I continually wrestle with so many of these trade-offs and the complexity are being laid at the hands of these internal corporate processes. And that's just where the influence is right now. And thank God there's a weighing, right, and a thought process. To that point about incumbents, I'm struck by, I had some conversations with a fellow named Neil Simon who ran for the Senate, moderate, independent, on the basis of bipartisan reforms that had 60% or more of American, support, right? And he just couldn't get in the game. And I know others that are working on problem-solving voter databases, and Congress's approval rating in the teens, right, or the 9%, but incumbents continually reelected. And I think this might be a place where at some point companies will want to look at those. It might be sub-optimizing in terms of the overall system, both in terms of responsiveness on complex societal issues that require collaboration, and also in distrust. Because too often, I don't think companies scratch the surface on this statistic around low trust in government. So much of it is around the perception that these incumbents are in the hands of special interests and corporate contributors, right?
Right.
So I think this is something that at some point I would hope that there would be a tipping towards those who are problem solvers and willing to look at systemic issues. The other thing I thought we could bring in is, in addition to the spending, there's a real gap around disclosure in lobbying and advocacy, and how companies and third parties honestly come up with their positions. And I think this bites companies. It comes back then they're not articulating when they are advocating on behalf of the system. As you talked about with JP Morgan, when you make a determination and you're weighing in on the system's goals rather than narrow or short-term interests, if companies don't articulate the logic behind those positions, and that's a complete black box right now. If you look at the disclosure data on lobbying, it's cumbersome and useless. I will point out that there was some progress at the World Economic Forum on a metric for disclosing lobbying positions that could be interesting. And it might be something for companies to look at, where you just articulate how it's aligned and on what basis you did that. The last thing I would say on that is to align the intensity of your advocacy. There's a huge gap in third-party trade associations and companies they may say they're aligned on carbon or climate. That's the biggest one, right? But it's number 15 on the things that they mention in any of their meetings with their members of Congress. And to elevate or reconsider systems issues in priority weighting as opposed to narrow issues, huge opportunity, I think.
Right. Elizabeth, thank you. In a sense, this sounds like a problem of the tragedy of the commons. Everyone has their own self-interest. To David's point, maybe no company wants to go first to support the disruptor, the third-party candidate, or a disruptive change to the political system, like supporting open primaries or ranked choice voting or fair districts, because we have these narrow self-interests, and yet the entire system is subject to this chaotic set of outcomes. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and go back to this theme of polarization and ask each of you, David, starting with you, how does the behavior of companies making these contributions in maybe a self-interested way, not considering the systemic risks, how is that contributing to societal polarization? And what's the solution to that?
I think one of the things that I think about in how companies are contributing in their action and inaction to this discussion is the increase in diversity of how people get their information now and what are trusted sources of information. And you have people who, if you have a large company that employs a few 100,000 people, that organization will be a microcosm of the different communities where your employees come from. I think a place where companies can no longer say, well, we're not political and we don't get involved. I think it is incumbent on them to think about how they are communicating to their employees, just starting with their employees. You can include in that their networks. And you think about a company like Facebook, for example, they have the ability to communicate to more people than any one news outlet at this point in time. I think being deliberate about how they use that platform to talk to their employees, to talk to their networks, their stakeholders, it's a place where they can, and I think Bruce made this point earlier, if you're focusing on fundamental things like democracy, I think you're able to add in a positive way to the national discussion and try to move away from polarization and more toward, here are the facts, here are the things that we are aligned on. And I think the companies that have done this really well are the ones who are able to tie who they are as a company, what their ethos is, and what's important to them to the necessity to find some middle ground. And get away from polarization. And I think about an example like Target, and this was less political polarization, but it was a wrought time in Minneapolis, right after George Floyd's death, when there was a lot of property damage and violence and just confusion in the demonstrations there, and real tension between the police and the community. I thought their statement on, why they're prioritizing investing in their community, protecting their employees as well as other, members of the Minneapolis community, and investing in that community and trying to essentially address some of the up and downstream factors of, that are causing more tensions between the police and the community. I thought that was really smart. And I think companies can find opportunities like that to say, this is who we are, this is why this is important to us, and here's how we're finding middle ground, and have others. I think minimum wage is an interesting place there as well, where I think you've seen one party pull away and say this is not the government's place, it's bad for business. You had another party who said this is absolutely government's place, and if the government doesn't do it, nobody will. And we've had companies step in and say, well, we have a perspective here, we think we're going to invest in our employees, and so we're taking our part, we'll let you deal with the politics of it, but we do think it is important to pay people a living wage, and regardless of your party affiliation, we know that people making the minimum wage in most parts of the country are not able to live. So here's how we're going to address it. So I think it's being able to tie the company's ethos, and again, that's why it's important to have this set of principles, that they have a set of principles that they can lean back on and reference, and apply that to any given situation. I think that helps use their platform to get away from polarization and find middle ground.
Great, thank you. Bruce, how are you thinking about the use of the code, the establishment of principles as a way to reduce societal polarization?
I think you have to take a close look at the company's political spending, because the company's spending are really underwriting the parties. Jeffrey Cabaservice, the director of research at the Niskanen Center, wrote a seminal book, Rule or Ruin, which dealt with the rise and fall of moderate Republicans. Jeffrey Cabaservice is writing about this as a Republican from a Republican perspective, but it is a very important scholarly work, but it's very important for understanding what is happening politically. Companies really have to take a hard look at where their money is going and what their money is enabling. Again, the model code provides the framework for that, and then provisions to deal with that. But I would also urge people to take a look at the conflicted consequences report and the last section of the report. The last section, which has pie charts on the breakdown of the contributions to the Governors Association, state legislative campaign committees, and attorneys general associations of both parties. And take a look at sort of the balance, where you have, predominant amount of money, much more money going to one party than to another party. What does that mean in terms of electoral consequences? I think, one example is looking at 2010, where you had, major changes in state houses and state legislatures. What followed from that politically that I think has had a major impact policy-wise and politically over the last decade, and I think in many cases has had contributed to an exacerbation of the polarization that we have. So companies really have to take a hard look at that, and I think that that these become very important as companies make the decisions again on whether to spend, or if they do spend, how they approach their spending, and looking very closely at those consequences. And tying into what David is talking there about in terms of some of the broader consequences dealing with minimum wage, inequality, and I would say pulling back from some of sort of the cultural patterns that you've had over the years in the political spending by companies.
Thank you. And Elizabeth, let me kind of reframe the question a little bit. Given that companies increasingly are one of the most trusted, the private sector, one of the most trusted institutions in our society, in addition to the military, business seems to be trusted much more so than does the public sector. So people have given the private sector a lot of credibility, but many people feel the system is rigged. And with the huge amounts of money that are being spent by companies to influence political decisions, many people feel their voice doesn't matter at all. Thus, they become disaffected and polarization grows. So from the work you're doing at the Herb Institute, what advice do you have about addressing that conundrum?
Yeah, other than that, we'll get that done by August.
Yeah, at least in the next 5 minutes, please.
Yes. But I want to talk about this question of business as the most trusted institution. I think there's a real danger that companies ride in heroically. You know, CEOs, companies like to be proactive, like to take initiative, like to be problem solvers, ride in heroically as if they are neutral outsiders coming in to fix something that was broken by those people, right?
Mm,
And I think it's going to come back to that could backfire very quickly for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer for 2021, trust in business is very mixed. CEOs are not very well trusted. My employer is trusted. Trust in business in the US is not very high. It's around the world that it's higher. So there are a number of qualifiers on that. So I would not take that as immunity. And
okay.
the other is that the causes of distrust are often the role of lobbying and special interest groups, right? So this could come right back. And thirdly, there's not very good disclosure. So when there's more disclosure, people may really come back. But we are in a narrow window where I think companies can use that license to invest in those institutions, in the processes that people would find trustworthy. That's why I think it's worth reconsidering the systemic risks of continuing business as usual or making incremental changes. We are in a stage of a vicious cycle of destructive conflict where we're in a power struggle that if the other side wants it, we don't want it, even if it's in our own interests. That is the most risky stage of destructive conflict. So it's worth it for companies to invest in the systems that people would trust. And I think that's what should guide us. I think Microsoft did a really interesting thing when they were criticized for their PAC spending. The employees were not aware of these objectors that were being supported or the voting rights. They went through a process of engagement to weigh trade-offs, to learn more about the consequences, and ended up having a program to invest in democracy,
Mhm.
to look at the reforms. There are groups like, there's a report called Our Common Purpose that is a bipartisan approach to understanding reforms that would help build trust. I think if companies were to refocus on that, they could use that trust for greater good. The other thing I think they should do is look at their trade associations and challenge the processes and transparency of how those trade associations determine whether to invest in narrow benefits or the system.
So my final question, and we really just have a few minutes for this big question, which is how does all this add up to possibly affecting the behavior of elected officials? So we have heard a critique over the past several months about woke capital, a suggestion that companies should not be expressing their views on voting rights in particular, and just, focus on whatever their core business is. So, David, what is maybe an ambitious goal here to get elected officials to tone down the rhetoric, to act in a more civil way, and to find, a less polarizing way to behave in their jobs?
Yeah, I think that particular example of weaponizing the term woke and making it a bad thing for companies to speak up on behalf of marginalized communities, many of which include their employees and others, was really irresponsible on behalf of uh, elected officials who were clearly putting their own self-interest and the interests of their party above what is best for the country. And I think the way that I would instruct elected officials to take a more proactive role in moving away from polarization is taking the same advice that we've given to companies, which is to think about how your rhetoric and your action has an impact on the larger community, and to essentially put country over party or over self-interest, and or to at least be more transparent about it. Because Elizabeth made a great point about companies coming in and having this like, oh well, we're here to save the day. Let's be very clear, and I think it's smart when companies are clear about it. But a lot of those, minimum wage moves by large companies is because they know state and local officials are raising the minimum wage around the country, and they're trying to get ahead of it, and also want to, kind of speak to it from a federal perspective. Same thing with companies like Facebook, advocating for a national standard on internet regulation. So I think if we can be more transparent about what your objective is, but also be responsible about the collateral impact of your rhetoric and of the positions that you're taking, I think that will help drive better outcomes, and it requires us being a little more direct and honest about what we're trying to achieve. And I think right now, unfortunately, in the voting rights issue, folks have benefited from the deep level of confusion and have added to that confusion by weaponizing terms like woke capital. So I think the elected officials involved need to take more responsibility for steering the discussion away from polarization and just being clear about what you're trying to achieve.
Right. Thank you. Bruce, give you the final word here on this topic about the relationship between changes in corporate behavior and how that it might impact elected officials.
I would urge companies to adopt the model code. You keep coming back to that because it does provide a framework.
Mm-hmm.
I think it provides a much needed framework, not only to protect the company, but a framework for them to look at their broader obligations and responsibilities. And the model code does that in a very practical manner. It really takes risk management and expands the concept, the definition of risk management, to include that the sort of the broader environment in which the company operates. I also think that one final thing. There's a professor at the University of Michigan, Mark Mizruki, who wrote the book, The Fracturing of the American Corporate Elite. That's a very important book about dealing with CEO leadership and how it has changed, and how it's changed really at the end of the 70s, with the advent of Jack Welch, where the CEOs began looking inward and began looking at their pocketbook.
Mm-hmm.
And you had corporate statesmen, at people who looked more broadly, who would be on national commissions, who would look at the national interest and the national perspective, and be put on government commissions to address broad issues. There needs to be a return to that, where you have the leadership of the high senior leadership of companies really looking much more broadly, thinking much more broadly. But again, I return, the model code is the place to start.
So Elizabeth, Bruce, and David, thank you so much for your time, and we thank our colleagues at the Niskanen Center as well. And this is a conversation definitely to be continued. And Elizabeth, did you have something you wanted to add?
A 10-seconder.
Please.
Bruce, with the Corporate Political Responsibility Task Force, Bruce will be our first expert dialogue on June 29th, diving deep into the model code, SEC disclosure, and preparing for 22 campaigning. And Mark Mizruki will be there on August 5th, because we learned a lot from him at the beginning of the Niskanen series. So
Great.
we would love to continue this conversation.
Yeah, and we can send everyone a note on that program. So I'll turn it back over to Bonk. And again, thank you all for your participation.
Great. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, panelists. This was so fun to listen in. I've got a lot to think about. And thanks to everybody for joining us. We have more coming up. The final session of Divided We Fall is coming up on June 29th. That is going to focus on policy solutions and directly addressing these issues that are happening within our government. You'll find that at dividedwefall4.eventbrite.com. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.